The church was filled with mourners, the air heavy with grief and sorrow. The casket, a simple yet elegant affair, stood at the front of the room, draped in flowers. The funeral service had begun quietly, the soft murmur of prayers and whispers filling the air. But no one could have prepared for the unsettling event that occurred moments later. Tasha's family was devastated. She had been a vibrant, kind woman, taken too soon by a sudden illness. As the ceremony unfolded, the mood was somber but peaceful, until something unnatural began to happen. The first strange sound was subtle at first, a faint rustling, but it wasn't the kind of sound made by the wind or even a stray piece of paper. This was something different. It came from the casket. The priest who had been reading a passage from the Bible paused. His voice faltered. The rustling grew louder, closer, almost as if something was moving inside the coffin. The mourners turned, their expressions shifting from confusion to growing discomfort. Then, without warning, the lid of the casket shifted. It didn't just creak, it opened just a fraction, revealing an unexpected sight. A large brown snake slithering out from inside, emerging from the dark confines of the casket like it had been waiting. A collective gasp spread through the room. The snake didn't act aggressively. It wasn't writhing or hissing. It moved calmly, deliberately, its dark eyes scanning the mourners before it began to coil around the edges of the coffin. The atmosphere in the church grew heavier with every second. Was this a sign? A warning? Some people screamed and stumbled back, but most just stood frozen, unsure of what they were witnessing. Tasha's sister Marilyn was the first to react. She rushed toward the casket, instinctively trying to protect her sister's body. But as she reached for the snake, it didn't strike or show any sign of aggression. Instead, it retreated back into the coffin, moving as though it were following some silent command. The room felt suffocating. The mourners exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring among themselves. No one knew what was happening. Was this part of the funeral? Was this a sign from the beyond? The air was thick with uncertainty. Marilyn, visibly shaking, called for help, but no one knew what to do. The priest, his face pale, tried to continue the service, but it was impossible. No one could focus anymore. The snake, with its cold, calculating gaze, seemed to hold the entire room in a trance. The family and friends stood in silence, unsure how to proceed. Some wondered if they had just witnessed something unholy. Others looked around, hoping someone would have an explanation. Marilyn, unable to bear the suspense any longer, stepped forward and cautiously approached the casket. She reached for the lid, her hands trembling. The snake, hidden inside, was still. Slowly, she lifted the casket's lid, but it didn't budge. There was something wrong with the way the lid moved, as though it were caught on something. Then, with a sudden jerk, the casket lid flew open, and inside there was no snake, only Tasha's body, just as it had been. Nothing unusual, no snake, no signs of struggle, just the peaceful, serene face of her sister. The room fell deathly silent. What had they just seen? The priest stepped forward, his voice shaking. "This is a sign, a warning," he said, though he seemed unsure of his own words. He glanced nervously at the casket and then back at the family. "We must carry on with the ceremony." But no one felt the same anymore. The strange occurrence had left a lingering unease in the air, a deep, unsettling feeling that something more was at play. The snake. The way it had appeared and disappeared. It didn't make sense. It wasn't natural. Something else was involved. Something they couldn't explain. As the mourners shuffled back to their seats, the whispers grew louder. Was it a sign of something greater? Or had the grief and the loss clouded their minds? The question remained as the funeral continued, but the tension was palpable. No one could shake the image of the snake, its dark eyes and the sense that something had been disturbed that shouldn't have been. The church was still. The atmosphere, once filled with hushed sobs and prayers, now felt thick with unease. The unsettling appearance of the snake had left everyone in a state of shock. Even the priest seemed unsure, his prayers growing more hurried, as though he were trying to rush through them, as if the silence and the lingering unease in the room were choking him. The mourners were no longer focused on the solemn ritual of saying goodbye to Tasha. Instead, their eyes darted nervously from one another, each trying to make sense of what had just happened. No one had expected the snake. No one had even imagined it might be part of the ritual. The snake was something else, something out of place in the solemnity of the occasion. Marilyn, Tasha's younger sister, stood at the front of the room, staring at the coffin, her heart pounding in her chest. She was trembling, her mind unable to piece together what had just occurred. The moment the snake had slithered out of the casket, it felt like everything had shifted. The funeral wasn't just about her sister anymore. It had turned into something unnatural. For a brief moment, Marilyn had thought she saw something in the air, the faintest flicker of movement behind the coffin, as if someone had been watching them from the shadows. But when she turned to look, there was nothing. "What does this mean?" she whispered to herself, shaking her head, unable to find an explanation. She glanced over at her aunt and uncle, who were still seated, eyes wide in disbelief, too stunned to speak. The priest, now visibly flustered, closed the prayer book and nodded toward the casket. We need to continue," he stammered, his voice trembling. "We cannot let fear take control. We must honor Tasha." But his words fell on deaf ears. Marilyn couldn't shake the feeling that the snake was not the end of it. Whatever had happened was just the beginning. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. A gnawing sense that something deeper, something more dangerous was tied to her sister's passing. The snake wasn't just an anomaly. It had to mean something. Something had been unleashed. As the priest began to speak again, his words fell into the background of Marilyn's thoughts. She wasn't listening anymore. Her mind raced, replaying every moment since her sister's sudden death. Had her mother known something? Had she been hiding something about the family? Marilyn's eyes flickered toward the coffin, the unease growing stronger with each passing second. She had to know. Marilyn reached for the side of the coffin, her heart pounding as she placed her hand on the cool wood. Her fingers brushed lightly against it. She could feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration coming from inside, like a low hum. It was as if the coffin itself was alive, breathing with the weight of something trapped inside it. Her breath hitched. She quickly pulled her hand back, but the pull of the coffin was irresistible. Something inside was calling to her, urging her to open it again, to confront whatever it was that had not stayed buried. "What are you doing?" her aunt called out, her voice sharp with concern. "Leave it alone. This isn't the time." But Marilyn couldn't stop. She ignored her aunt's warning, her gaze fixed firmly on the coffin. The thought that something still remained inside the casket, something connected to the snake, to the dark presence in the room, was all-consuming. Without thinking, she reached for the coffin's lid once more. This time it opened with ease. The rusted hinges squealed as she pushed it aside, revealing the body of her sister Tasha, exactly as they had left it, peaceful, serene, as though nothing had ever happened. But when Marilyn looked closer, she noticed something odd. Tasha's fingers were clenched tightly, as if holding something in her hand. With shaking hands, Marilyn carefully pried open Tasha's fingers. What she found inside sent a chill down her spine. A small, ancient-looking key, covered in grime but clearly old, with strange markings etched along its surface. It looked nothing like a normal key, its design alien, unfamiliar, as if it belonged to some long-forgotten time. Before she could examine it further, a strange sound echoed from the shadows of the church. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. The mourners gasped, looking around in panic. It was as if something had shifted again, something more terrifying than the snake, something far more dangerous. Marilyn froze, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, until suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, ever so slightly, but enough to send the congregation into a state of pure fear. And then, from the shadows, the priest's voice trembled as he muttered, "It's too late." Marilyn's heart raced, the small, ancient key in her trembling hand. She couldn't look away from it. The markings on its surface were strange, cryptic symbols that seemed to move ever so slightly, almost as if they were alive. The chill in the air deepened, and an unsettling silence settled over the room. The growl that had echoed earlier now felt like it had come from within her, vibrating in her chest, pulling at her very core. She looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The mourners, once frozen in confusion, were now whispering nervously. Eyes darted from one face to another. The priest, who had stepped back in terror, seemed completely disoriented. He couldn't gather his words. Something far more terrifying than any death had unfolded here. "We need to leave," Aunt Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing Marilyn's arm. "This is wrong. All of this is wrong." But Marilyn couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the key. The feeling of being watched, of something pulling her in, was overwhelming. The quiet growl, was it coming from inside the church? From beneath the floor? Suddenly another noise, this time closer. A faint, soft, slithering sound coming from behind the altar. Marilyn spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it the snake again? But there was nothing. The air was thick with tension, as if everything around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Before Marilyn could react, she felt it. The unmistakable weight of something cold creeping up her spine. The presence was undeniable. It wasn't the snake. It wasn't even the air. It was as if something ancient, something that had been buried long ago, had just been awakened. And now it was here, with them. Her eyes darted back to the coffin, the empty void where Tasha's body had been. The strange presence was coming from that direction. Marilyn felt as if she were being pulled toward it, drawn in like a magnet. She felt her feet move involuntarily toward the coffin, her body betraying her as she stepped closer. Her aunt grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to hold her back, but Marilyn pushed past her, the key clutched tightly in her hand, its weight heavy, almost alive in her grasp. "What? What are you doing?" Aunt Sarah's voice was a mixture of fear and disbelief. Marilyn couldn't answer. She felt compelled to do something, something she couldn't explain. She reached for the coffin, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid just slightly. The growl from earlier grew louder, vibrating through her chest, almost as if it were inside her now. It wasn't a sound she could hear with her ears anymore. It was something deeper, a gnawing sensation inside her skull. The moment the lid opened, the air shifted. The lights above flickered violently, and the entire church seemed to vibrate. The priest staggered back, crossing himself, his face pale as he muttered prayers under his breath. But Marilyn couldn't stop. She looked inside the coffin once more, and what she saw made her stomach churn. Tasha's body was no longer just a body. The skin that had once been so peaceful now seemed taut, stretched unnaturally. Her eyes were open, glazed over, but not in death. They were empty, devoid of the person they had once belonged to. A small trickle of something dark and oily oozed from her mouth, pooling at the bottom of the coffin. A black substance that seemed to move, like it had a life of its own. Marilyn gasped, stumbling backward. This wasn't her sister. This wasn't death. This was something else. The key in her hand began to glow faintly, the symbols shimmering once more, reacting to something inside the coffin. A strange pressure built in the room, like the air itself had been compressed, ready to burst. Then from within the coffin, a whisper, the same one that had echoed through Marilyn's mind earlier, filled the air. "You shouldn't have opened it." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was her mother's voice, but it was distorted, as if coming from somewhere deep inside the earth, an ancient voice full of sorrow and mourning. Marilyn's fingers tightened around the key. She had to do something. She had to stop this. But it was already too late. The ground beneath her feet shuddered, and the coffin lid slammed shut, as if pushed by an invisible force. The darkness in the room deepened, the light from the candles flickering as the temperature dropped. A sickening silence followed, and all that remained was the sound of the key, still glowing in her hand, pulsing like a heartbeat. Before she could react, the doors of the church creaked open, and a dark figure stepped inside, shrouded in shadow. The room held its breath. Marilyn knew the presence had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until the truth was revealed. The moment the dark figure stepped into the church, the air around them seemed to shift. The temperature dropped drastically, and the flickering candlelight cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The figure's presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the darkness of the room. It was something much deeper. It was as if the space itself had shifted, as if reality had become malleable under this figure's gaze. Marilyn, still gripping the strange key in her hand, felt her heart race. The voice, her mother's voice, still echoed faintly in her ears, warning her of something she didn't fully understand. And now this figure was standing at the entrance, as if waiting for something. But waiting for what? The figure's face was hidden in shadows, a black cloak obscuring everything but the faintest outline of their features. But despite the obscurity, Marilyn could feel the weight of their gaze upon her. It was piercing, penetrating, as if the figure could see right through her, into her deepest fears, her hidden thoughts. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the situation. The strange black substance on the coffin, the glowing key, the sinister voice that seemed to come from nowhere. It was all spiraling out of control. None of this made sense, but she couldn't stop herself from feeling like this was destiny, or some twisted part of it. The figure's head tilted slightly, and for the briefest moment, it seemed as if they were acknowledging the key in Marilyn's hand. The air grew thicker. The whispers in the church grew louder, voices swirling around her like a storm. They spoke in tongues, ancient words incomprehensible, but each syllable felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. "You opened it," the figure spoke, their voice low, resonating with a deep, chilling tone. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. And in that moment, Marilyn understood. It knew. It knew exactly what she had done. "I had to," Marilyn whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "I had to know the truth." The figure nodded slowly, almost approvingly. Then, with a movement so fast it seemed almost unnatural, they raised one gloved hand, pointing towards the coffin. "The truth comes with a cost, child. The past has risen, and the secrets that were buried are no longer safe." Marilyn felt the ground beneath her feet shift once more, a deep tremor reverberating through the walls. The coffin in front of her began to rattle, the lid shaking violently as if something inside was trying to escape. She took a hesitant step back, her pulse quickening. The growl from earlier was back, louder, more forceful. Suddenly, the coffin burst open once again, but this time, there was no snake. Instead, a shadowy figure, a human form, but distorted, emerged from the darkness inside the casket. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't quite part of the living world. It hovered above the body of Tasha, who lay eerily still, her skin pale, her eyes still wide open, lifeless. Marilyn gasped, her hand instinctively clutching the key tighter, as though it were the only thing holding her, grounded in the madness unfolding before her. The figure, once a shadow, now solidified, taking the shape of a tall man with a face that was both familiar and terrifyingly unfamiliar. It was Tasha's face, but twisted, distorted by something dark, ancient, and evil. "Tasha," Marilyn whispered, her voice trembling, "is that you?" The shadow's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't her sister's smile. It was something sinister, something far too cold. "No," it said, its voice distorted. "I am what she became. She was the vessel, the one who broke the barrier." Marilyn's heart pounded in her chest. What was this? What was Tasha now? The figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against the coffin, and with a voice that sounded like the echoes of an ancient curse, it spoke again. "The truth you seek, it's not what you expected." The snake was not the warning. It was the seal, the one she kept hidden. "Your mother knew it would come to this. She protected you from this darkness. But now, it is too late." Marilyn couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as if she were suffocating, and everything around her seemed to close in. The figure's presence was suffocating, overwhelming, and she could feel it. The dark force inside the church, growing stronger, more present. "I never wanted you to find this," the figure whispered, its voice like a hiss. "But you've opened the door. Now you'll walk the path your mother could never finish." The shadows seemed to reach for her, the darkness growing thicker, colder. Marilyn's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground. The key pulsed in her hand, hot, almost burning her palm. The truth, the dark truth, was ready to consume her. But in that moment, the growl intensified, a deep, guttural sound, as though something immense and ancient was breaking free. Marilyn lifted her gaze, barely able to move. And then, from the shadows, she saw it. The snake, no longer confined, slithering back into the church as if it had been waiting for this. The snake slithered slowly across the cold stone floor, its eyes gleaming like black obsidian, reflecting the dim candlelight. It wasn't just a snake anymore. It was a presence, an entity that seemed to absorb the very essence of the room, its scales shimmering in the darkness. Marilyn's heart raced as she struggled to get up, the weight of the situation pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again, this time softer, almost sorrowful. You were never supposed to find this. You were supposed to be safe. But it was too late. The secrets that had been buried for generations had been uncovered, and now Marilyn was trapped in the very darkness her mother had tried to shield her from. The ritual, the hidden book, and the snake, it all pointed to one thing, a power far beyond her comprehension, a power her mother had tried to protect her from. The dark figure, Tasha's twisted form, loomed over her, its shadow stretching across the room like it was ready to consume her. You thought you could stop it, the figure hissed, but the truth is inevitable. The darkness will always find its way out. Marilyn's grip tightened on the key, and for a moment, she felt an unfamiliar strength surge through her. She had to fight. She couldn't let her mother's sacrifices be in vain. She had to stop this, or else the darkness would claim everything. With a burst of determination, Marilyn lunged toward the altar, her breath ragged, her mind spinning. She had no plan, no strategy, just the need to survive. The key, the ancient key that had led her here, was her only weapon. As she reached the altar, the snake coiled behind her, but she didn't look back. The power of the key surged through her hand as she slammed it down onto the altar, the symbols glowing once more. The air crackled as a force, unseen but undeniable, erupted from the key, pushing against the darkness that surrounded her. The room trembled violently. The snake hissed, retreating into the shadows as if it had been repelled. The growling sound, the unnatural hum that had been filling the air, faded into an eerie silence. Marilyn's heart raced as she stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But something was changing. The shadows in the church began to recede, and the oppressive air lifted. The oppressive darkness that had threatened to swallow everything began to pull back, as if it were being sealed away once again. She felt lightness, a relief she hadn't known in hours. Her mother's voice spoke again, clearer this time, filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. You've done it, Marilyn. You've sealed it. The figure of Tasha's twisted form dissolved into nothingness, as though the force that had animated it had been banished with the key. The church, once filled with fear, now felt still. The coffin, the book, and the dark forces, they were all gone. But something had changed in Marilyn. She had faced the darkness, and although it had been sealed away for now, she knew that the truth was something that would always stay with her. The world her mother had protected her from was still out there, waiting, watching. As the candles flickered softly, Marilyn stood alone in the church, holding the key, which now seemed lifeless, its power spent. But its presence remained. The truth, the knowledge of the forces beyond their understanding, would always be with her. With a heavy heart, Marilyn closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the calm after a storm, the calm before the next wave. And Marilyn knew one thing for certain: the darkness would never fully leave. It would always find a way back.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.